Okay, so arrays are called arrays in JavaScript. In other languages, are called lists, and it kind of describes very accurately kind of how you would think about an array, right? Essentially, it's a list of things. Instead of but in JavaScript, rather than calling them things, we prefer the word elements. It's a little bit more precise. And so when I say an array has 6 elements, it basically means this list has 6 things. But once again, it's just a more refined way of kind of making sure we're very clear about what we're talking about. If you think about a list, right, a few things that really kind of stand out. One is that you can have many things, and in fact, in JavaScript, there really is no cap on the amount of things you can have in an array. There is a theoretical cap depending on kind of how big your computer's memory is, but in practice, an array you can think of it as basically an uncapped list, right? You can put as many things as you want into it. And the second aspect of a list that's kind of important to know is if you think about most lists, right, like there's an order, right? There's a hierarchy. If I add 3 things, like one of the things is going to be first, one of the things is going to be second, one of the things is going to be third. Similarly, in arrays, there always is going to be a first element, a second element, or a third element. And more often than not, when we use arrays, it's because that order is important. So when you look at arrays, don't just think, oh, it's a collection of things, but think of it as it's an ordered list, right? And so things and the order in which they're in typically has a lot of value, especially when we actually try to go through this list, and we'll talk about how to use a for loop. We'll talk more about how to use a for loop at the end of this lecture. Okay, cool. So these are all examples of arrays, or at least lines 3, 5, and 9 are. Arrays can hold as many things as you want. It can hold as many different types of things as you want, and it can hold as many different. It can hold as many things as you want, and it can hold as many types as you want with no cap on any type, right? So on line 3, we have an array of 3 numbers. On line 5, we have an array of 3 strings. And on line 9, we have an array of 5 different things, including booleans, including nulls and strings, numbers. Later on, you'll see we can also throw functions in there. We can throw objects in there. Basically, anything you can create in JavaScript, you can toss. You can toss it in an array, right? So an array is kind of this nice grab bag, vehicle or container almost. It can hold whatever it is that you want. A few questions. Sorry, I don't know names. I'm just going to point and say you, so don't be offended. You.
So for the a value one, with just the standalone value.
Line 7.
String.
Line 7.
Yeah, I can't really see.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so for that, you wouldn't generally call that an array, right?
That is, sorry, yeah, great. So this is not an array. And the reason why we have this here is because we actually wanted to show you can store a variable in an array as well. So we created on line 7 just so we can throw it in on line 9. But yeah, this is not an array. In JavaScript, the square brackets is the most common way for you to make an array. So if you don't see these square brackets, it's not an array. Yeah. And there's a question at the back too, I think. Okay, cool. Yeah. So line 7 is not an array. It's just we're creating a variable to show you that arrays can also hold variables. Okay. One of the things that you may have already covered, maybe not, is this type of, I guess, keyword, right? It's not really a function even. So type of is what's known as a reserved word in JavaScript. Sorry. So for reserved words in JavaScript, you know something is a reserved word. Usually, when you type it in most JavaScript editors, it will turn out to be a different color than the rest, right? So you type the word function, you type the word return. Those are called reserved words, right? And so you can't have a variable called function. You can't have a variable called return. Type of, in the same vein, you can't have a variable called type of because that means something very specific in JavaScript. And what type of does is you do a type of, and then you go space, and you put like a variable usually or a data point after it, and it'll tell you what the data point is. For arrays, one of the things that you'll notice that's kind of a little bit misleading here is when I create an array called names, and I do a type of that names array, I don't get back an array. I actually get back object. And the reason for this is because in JavaScript, it's an object-oriented program, which means that almost everything is an object when you kind of really boil it down to it. But in basically implementation of an array is actually that of an object. And so when you use type of actually sees it as an object, not as an array. So all of this is, the whole point of me telling you this is because if you want to ascertain whether or not something is an array, type of is actually not a really good way to do it because it can't really differentiate between objects and arrays. Having said that, there is a tool that is much better equipped to determine whether or not something is an array, and that's this array.isArray function. We're not going to talk too much about classes in JavaScript for this particular prep course, but in the full-time curriculum we will dive more into it. But essentially, a class, you can think of it as basically like a parent, almost like a parent concept. And so everything that's kind of made, like we use this parent concept to kind of make offsprings of it, right? And so the reason why this A in array is capitalized is to denote that this is an array class, and any array we make is a instantiation of the array class. It's like a child of the array class. And so you never have to make your own array class in almost every JavaScript editor you ever use. Things like arrays, strings, numbers, functions, these are made for you. But one of the things that's really cool about the array class is the array class has nifty functions built into it that you can call. And so in any JavaScript editor you're in, if you just type in array.isArray, that I can pretty confidently say it will exist, right? And so when you call that function, you type in array.isArray, and it's a function, so you can pass in an argument. In this case, the argument is whatever it is you want to check. And array.isArray is going to give you back one of two possible values, either true or false. Either the thing you're giving it is an array or it's not, right? And this is able to detect to differentiate between objects and arrays. So if you get back true, it is definitely an array and nothing else. If it's false, it means it's definitely not an array. The only other thing that I'll just kind of caveat here with, on day one, we may have told you some good variable naming habits. One of the things we talked about was camel case, right? As in, if you have a multi-word variable, keep everything lowercase, keep all the first letters capitalized except for the first one. And the reason for that is because of this, is because when you capitalize the first one, conventionally speaking, it means you're talking about a class rather than just like a random variable you may have created. And so while this is not binding, so to speak, it is just like another best practice that you want to be aware of. So another reason to not just kind of name variables whatever you want, whenever you want. There are certain conventions that most programming like structures follow. Yes, Matt?
So instead of just console logging array.isArray with the names inside the parentheses, can we just get rid of class altogether and just put names.isArray?
No, because the isArray function is not attached to the names array. It's attached to the array class.
Also, doesn't attach itself to the name of the
Yeah, so let's think about, so I guess I tend to make really bad analogies over the course of like my other classes. So if you want to kind of keep it in this kind of parent-child dynamic here, if I think of my dad as like the parent and I'm like the child, right? The array capitalized this class, this is my dad, right? And I am like a child, so I'm like a lowercase array, right? And so my dad has access to certain things that I don't have access to, right? And so when I call this isArray function, this is not like my thing. This is like my dad's thing, like my dad's bank account, my dad's house, whatever it is, right? Like I can't just go in and use it whenever I want. I have a certain like bank account or attributes that I can use, but if you see this dot here, basically whenever you call a function, if you call something like array dot the function, it means that this function belongs to the thing before the dot. And so in this case, the isArray function does not belong to me, it belongs to my dad. And so in this case, this array function does not belong to any array. It actually belongs to kind of this parent array class. Yes?
So names belongs to isArray, to the child then, right?
Yeah. Belongs is a little bit of a tricky concept. When I say belongs to, what I really mean is like the class has these, we call them methods, and we'll talk about these I think next Thursday for you. But the class is able to use certain functions, but the child is not, right? And when I say belongs to, like, it's not like this names array belongs to this array class. It's more like an instantiation of it, right? It's like, yeah. Sorry.
So that is referencing to the names through the child, kind of?
So even if if you notice here on line 5, like we're passing in a string, right? Nothing to do with arrays. We're still calling array.isArray. And the reason for that is because this isArray function doesn't belong to whatever you're passing in. It belongs to whoever's calling it, right? So isArray is it's attached to the array class. So when I call it, as long as I'm making sure I'm saying, hey, parent array class, you have an isArray function. I want to use it. I'm going to give you something to check, and whatever I give you is not attached to you at all. So this could be anything, right? So these two are completely separate. Yes.
Not to get too far into it, but can you give an example of another class?
Yeah.
Array?
Any data type that we've talked about is a class. So there is a Boolean class, there is a number class, there is a string class.
That kind of all do the same thing. I mean, they have these little functions that work.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm not sure if you had a chance to like look at documentation yet. There's one called WDN. It's like, or sorry, MDN. It's like stands for Mozilla Developers Network. It's kind of like the master copy of JavaScript documentation. If I just search JavaScript, I'll do string class. Should be the first hit. Yep. Cool. So on MDN's website, if you go here, you actually see all of the. So this is a string class. I'll share the link out on Slack so y'all can check it out if you want. But on the left-hand side here, you'll see like all of these methods. These are all things that are that comes kind of equipped with the string class. One thing you kind of want to just be careful about here is a lot of these are inherited by the child, but not all of them are. Right. So this is more like a master list, and when you read the details, it'll tell you which ones are inherited, which ones aren't. But yeah, if on the other hand, if I do like a number class, same idea. There's a ton of functions at those numbers. Any object you ever create in JavaScript is inheriting from a class. You can kind of think of it that way. All right, so it looks like the number class has things like is finite, is integer, is not a number, etc. Anything else? Cool. Awesome. Okay. Sorry for the cough, guys. Okay. So, okay, yeah. So array.isArray, it's our best handy way to check whether or not something is an array. Bracket access. Hopefully, this is somewhat familiar to you. You've probably seen in the pre-work. If I have an array and I want to access any particular element, bracket notation is probably one of the easiest ways to do so. How I use it is I once again go back to my handy square brackets. I put it after the names array. And notice how there's no space in the middle to kind of denote that, hey, this is kind of one thing. And within these brackets, I put in a number. The number is, once again, this is why order is important. The number is like the numerical like position of the element that you're looking at. Just remember in arrays, or in most computer science, we start at the 0th index, not 1. So the first element is at index 0. The next element is at index 1, and so on and so forth. And so the max index we ever have is going to be the length of the array minus 1, right? So everything basically shifted left 1. And so here, if I want to print out the first three elements, George, John, Thomas, I do array index 0 for George, 1 for John, 2 for Thomas, or 2 for Thomas. And then obviously, if I try to print out the quote unquote fourth element or index 3, I get back undefined. And so this is something you also want to be careful about. JavaScript doesn't throw an error at you; it gives you back undefined. And so, take that for what it is, for what you want, but just know that it won't break the code, which sometimes is actually more dangerous in that it silently does something you don't want it to do, as opposed to you knowing something broke. Right? It's like if you're like babysitting, like you want to know what damage has been done rather than just having the kids hide it and you not finding out until like days or weeks later. Right? So yeah. So once again, these are all things that just come built in, and so it's up to you to be aware of them. Okay. And then bracket assignment basically just means, hey, if I want to override an existing element with a new element, how do I do that? It's basically the same as bracket notation, except now we use an equal sign, right? The assignment operator, and say, hey, make this element at the 0th position, aka the first element, equal to Washington, and then so on and so forth. And so once again, very straightforward. This pretty much follows how we traditionally think about variables and variable assignments. Oh, sorry. Okay. Any questions so far? Cool. All right. Okay, so one of the things that and this is just one of the this is more like a sidebar, almost like the more you know kind of message. If you remember on for you it would have been last second day two. If you worked on a workshop problem that said capitalize every other letter in a string, right? I'm sure most of you, or at least a lot of you, probably tried to go to the string and do something like that, where you say, hey, change the letter at the first position to be, a capital G, right, or a lowercase g, or whatever it may be. And you realize very shortly after it doesn't work. In fact, what you had to do is you had to kind of recreate the string from scratch, letter by letter. And it's because of this idea that in JavaScript there's kind of the primitive values and the non-primitive values, or the complex values. Primitives are things like numbers, booleans, and strings, and also nulls and undefined. And they're called that because you can't, once you create it, you can't change it. And that's to contrast it with things like arrays and objects, which you can create. And once you've created, you are able to change it, right? So if I have this array here of 5 letters, I have this string here of a word with, or a string with 5 letters. If I use the array bracket notation, I say, hey, change the first to a lowercase g. I do the same for the string. When I print it out, it will change for the array. It will not change for the string. And once again, this is because arrays and objects in JavaScript are complex, which means you are able to change it once you've created it. Strings, numbers, and booleans, you are not able to change once you create it. So your only recourse really is to create another version of it with the value that you want. Good. Yeah. A lot of people tend to think, like, there are a lot of things about strings and arrays that make them look similar, and so people tend to think, oh, they must operate the same exact way. Here's one key way which they are different, right? So don't just kind of use both interchangeably. Kind of test it out, or at least make sure that do some research on documentation before you use anything that will work for strings, to make sure it does the same thing in arrays, because it might work just a little bit differently. Cool. All right, cool. So that's pretty much it in terms of the intro about the intro to arrays, the basics. For the rest of this class, we're going to go through a bunch of functions, and these are methods that are on the child, right? So if I create an array, this array can use a variety of things that are built in, and so we'll go through what those are. But any questions up to now about anything we've talked about, anything about the basics of arrays, kind of how to access it, how to change it, where they come from, all that fun stuff. Yes.
I think I remember saying that you can nest arrays within other arrays, right?
Yes, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. Yeah. Cool. Anything else? All right. Okay, so let's get to it. So I think there's maybe like half a dozen of these. So kind of just bear with me. I'll go through this a little bit fast, and I almost don't want you to spend too much time on kind of straight memorizing these. And the reason why is because really, in the real world, you're very rarely going to code in an environment without access to the internet. And really, a better use of your time than memorizing all these functions, exactly what they do and what the arguments are and what the outputs are, is to kind of feel comfortable looking at the documentation for them if you ever get confused. Even now, whenever I use a function, I use slice versus splice. I always just pull the documentation for it really quickly to refresh my memory on this is what the first argument is, and this is what the second argument is, and this is kind of what it does, right? So when I go through these, make sure you understand how they're working. Don't get too hung up on memorizing the exact inputs, because when you use them, you will guaranteed almost always want to pull the documentation first, just to make sure you're clear on how to use these. Cool. Okay. So the length property is the first one, and this is the first one that's a property and not a function or not a method. The distinction here is we call methods because they're functions. For properties, we just say, hey, what is it, right? A function is basically asking the array to do something. A property is more asking it like a straight question, right? And it'll give you back a response. So the main property we're talking about here is a .length property. As you can imagine, it tells you how long the array is. And if I have an array, sorry, if I have an empty array or array with no things, I will get back an array length of 0, which means as long as I have an array, whenever I use array.length, I can always be assured to get back a number. So that's probably the most important thing to know about the length property. Okay, push. Oh, and the other one is length is obviously length has nothing to do with index. So if I have an array of 3 things, the length is 3. right? The length is not 2 because the length basically tells you how many elements are in the array, and we start at 1 in that case. Okay, the dot push method. Dot push, we call it like we do here on line 6. So this is a typo here. Anywho, names dot push, right? We have an array. We do dot push. James, push basically takes in and takes in. We'll say 1 element for now. You can always add more as well. It takes the elements that you give it and shoves it to the end of the array. That's pretty much it. So when I do names dot push James, I console log out names. I now see that my array has 4 elements. One is a key distinction across all these functions we do is like make note of 3 things. The first is what the function does. The second thing is whether or not the function changes the original array, and the third thing is what the function returns. Okay. So what this function does is this function adds the element that you give it into the end of the array. Okay. Does this function change the original array? Yes, it does, right? We have names here. We do names.push. When I console.log out names again, we see that clearly the array has changed, right? So this changes the original array. And then lastly is what does this array return? And the array and what the .push function organically returns is the length of the new array, right? So that's why when I store this new length variable equals to whatever names.push returns, and I print out new length, I get back 4. Okay. Yes.
So for line 6, can you go over what new is?
Yeah, like I said, that's a typo. So like these 2 should line up like that.
So
Yep.
For line 9, how is it displaying the length of the array?
Because names.push returns back the new length of the array. In this case, it returns number 4, and we store the number 4 in this variable called new length.
Okay.
So when I console log out new length, I'm console logging out 4.
So it wouldn't just be outputting names, but with James inserted.
Right. So the function returns the length of the new array, right? Like that's what the function does. Right? It's like saying like, oh, what's 7 plus 6? Like you're gonna get back like a number value, right? Like, and so once again, if I was to look up JavaScript array push, you will see that the syntax is we call it this way. This is things that we want to put into the end of the array, and the return value is the new length of the array, once we call it. So it doesn't return the array, it returns the length of the array. Like by definition, this is what it does. Yes?
This returns the order of the array, not necessarily like the length of the actual array, right? So it returns the order of that array. So James is number 4, not the actual length of the array.
No, it returns the length of it. So how many elements are in the array now? And the reason for that is because with push, you'll see in the next slide, we can add multiple things. So if I have an array of 4 things and I push in 5 more things, it's going to tell me back, hey, 9, as in your list now has 9 things. Oh well, we didn't show it here, unfortunately. I'm sorry. But the idea here is that if I want to have more arguments here, like do James and then like David and then comma Tom, I push in 3 things. It'll just shove all 3 things in order to the end of my array, and it'll give me back, in this case, 6. Yes.
Just kind of going back in the beginning, can you define a variable to be an array with nothing in it?
Yes.
Do you just do the brackets?
Yep.
So it'd be let names equal brackets.
Yep. Yes.
And then if you push something into that empty array, it would then just have the 1.
Yep. Yes.
And if you're pushing multiple things into the array, is it just separated by commas? So if like the first element is string James, then comma, the next element was number 2, you would type in 2.
Yep, exactly. Do you guys use REPL in your class? Yeah, great. All right, so you're familiar with this UI then. Oh, too big. Yeah, so if I just something like let x equals this, and do x dot push, 12, and then David, and then a null, and actually I'll just return x directly. That's how that works. I think this answers all three of your questions, right?